So we see that the grammar of the opening of Genesis chapter 12 divides into three main parts: an introduction, a focus on blessings God would give to Abraham, and a focus on the blessings that God would bring to the whole world through Abraham. Understanding these verses in Genesis chapter 12 is important because in many respects, the stories of Abraham in Genesis illustrate how these promises God made to Abraham were fulfilled in his life. As Moses wrote about the patriarch, he shaped his stories in ways that drew attention to the words that God spoke to Abraham as he called him to the promised land. With this grammatical structure in mind, we're ready to see how the main themes of Abraham's life unfold from Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. We'll note that there are four major themes that appear in these verses. We'll begin with divine grace toward Abraham. Then we'll continue with the requirement of Abraham's loyalty to God. Then, God's blessings to Abraham. And finally, God's blessings through Abraham. The first motif, which occurs many times in the life of Abraham, is that God's relationship with Abraham was based on His grace. Divine grace appears in a subtle way in the introductory words of Genesis chapter 12, verse 1. As we've seen, there we read these words: "The Lord had said to Abram." These simple words reminded Moses' original audience that Abraham's relationship with God came about because God had entered into Abraham's life long before Abraham had done anything in service to God. Abraham's call came very early in his adult life. He had not left for Canaan, he had not conquered enemies, he had not committed to covenant faithfulness, he had not prayed for the righteous in Sodom and Gomorrah, he had not passed any test of faith. On the contrary, God called Abraham as His special servant simply because it pleased God to be gracious to Abraham. Now, of course, God's grace was not only shown in the initial stage of Abraham's walk with God. The grace of God is a theme that appears throughout the stories of Abraham, because God also showed mercy to the patriarch at every moment of his life. Because Abraham was a sinner, Abraham was in need of God's mercy all the time. For example, in the well-known verse of Genesis chapter 15, verse 6, we learn that even Abraham's saving righteousness was a gift of mercy. There we read these words: "Abraham believed the Lord, and He credited it to him as righteousness." As the Apostle Paul pointed out in Romans chapter 4, verse 3, and Galatians chapter 3, verse 6, the fact that God credited Abraham with righteousness indicated that this was an act of mercy, not a reward for good works. And it was through divine grace and mercy that Abraham received this and many other blessings from God. As Christians, we all know the importance of God's grace in our lives. We know that God initiates our relationship with Him by His grace, and we know that He sustains us in our relationship with Him by His grace. Where would we be without the mercy of God? Well, the same thing was true for Abraham. And more than this, God's grace was also essential for the lives of the Israelites for whom Moses wrote about Abraham. They too needed God's mercy in their lives, in their day, day after day. And for this reason, as Moses composed his stories of Abraham's life, he drew their attention over and over to God's grace. In addition to the theme of God's grace, we should also notice that Genesis chapter 12, verse 1 through verse 3 stresses Abraham's loyalty. God did not merely choose Abraham to receive His mercy. He showed mercy to the patriarch so that Abraham would respond with faithful obedience. As we have seen, The first imperative of Genesis chapter 12 verse 1 stresses Abraham's responsibility to be faithful to the Lord in a particular way. God commanded him there, "Leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you." It doesn't take much imagination to see that this divine call required enormous loyalty from Abraham. He was to leave his homeland and his father's estate behind and to go to a place yet to be shown him. Yes, God had shown mercy to Abraham, but Abraham was also expected to show deep-seated, loyal service to God.